Welcome to the show, where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Rate and review the show at kevinmd.com/rate. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/follow. Today in the show, we have Amber Gipson-Fine. She is a project manager, and she wrote the Kevin MD article, People Over Profit, Pfizer and Moderna Must Share Vaccine Technology. Amber, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
We'll get into your article in a little bit, but first off, can you share your story and journey to where you are today?
Absolutely. Thanks again for having me on. I am a trained epidemiologist, so I practice public health. And during the beginning of the pandemic, I was working in New York City in the Bronx, doing chronic disease, psychosocial oncology program coordination. And then I transitioned. I was going to move to Chicago, as my partner, now husband, is located here. And since the pandemic was brought on, I made the switch from chronic disease to infectious disease with COVID. And a lot of COVID clinical trials were coming out in the race to find the vaccine. And I had a privilege to get hired by Rush, start working under the infectious disease team under Dr. Beverly Shaw. And we were able to work on the AstraZeneca clinical trial. And then as other vaccines came on the market after clinical trial approval, then FDA approval, we moved forward in implementing those into the community, making sure that everybody was educated on side effects that we knew of at the time about vaccines, the importance of getting vaccinated, and really the life-changing technology that came about. So the clinical trials that I was working on weren't necessarily the mRNA vaccines that became on the market during that race, but everybody had to become quick experts on everything available to protect communities and make sure that fewer deaths from COVID happened. So epidemiologist by training, but current project manager within clinical trials at Rush. It's originally an HIV unit.
So from your perspective as an epidemiologist and a clinical trial expert, during the COVID pandemic, what were some of the biggest things that surprised you through that lens?
One of the biggest things that surprised me is when I was reading news articles, because when you're talking to the community, I think it's important to understand what's out there and what people are reading, not just from a scientific lens, because I'm also heavily biased. I know how to read science, and it's important that I was seeing what was out there. Originally, I thought everybody was going to be most fearful of vaccine side effects, or thinking that this had, a direct relation to some other misinformation. And the misinformation that came about was a different manifestation. It became heavily politicized in a way that I wasn't necessarily anticipating. I wasn't anticipating some people denying COVID as a phenomenon, especially when some families were being directly impacted by it, or even worse, had deaths in the family as a result of it. So my lens in community education really had to change. It involved a lot of listening to what people were actually afraid of and going more individualized than public health trains you to do. Because I was finding that in general, when news sources came out with information, yes, millions of people read it and some people were convinced by that scientific literature, but oftentimes so many individuals were still afraid. And I think that natural innate fear of the unknown, including when a new technology comes out, is really understandable. So what is the most effective is individual by individual, but of course the consequence of that is time, and you can't reach as many people when people don't trust a unified news source.
Now, can you give an example of how you individualized that messaging that was a little bit different from your traditional public health training?
Absolutely. I remember once adults became sort of unified, at least in what they had to do. So again, I practice in Chicago, and sooner rather than later, Chicago started implementing mandatory masking. A lot of employers became requiring the vaccine. So choice was limited in those specific contexts. But right when children were able to get the vaccine, so many parents, some of whom got the vaccine immediately or delayed and eventually got it, said, this is my life, and I did what I had to do because of either regulations or what I believed in science. But now I'm talking about my 6-year-old child. And that is a scary decision. So, what do you have to say about that, Amber? Like, should I be putting my child at potential risk when I don't know all of these effects that could potentially be impacting my child's life. And I am really sensitive to that. I'm not a parent, but I can imagine making a decision for yourself is very different than making a health decision for others. And whether we could, provide future data wasn't really relevant in that moment. The question was, do I get my child vaccinated right now? Do I wait 3 months? Am I going to blame myself if something else comes out in the news the next day? And that's a heavy decision. So we worked through those, and I would say that normally the counseling process involved what they perceived as risk, what was important to them. And so in a specific example, a family was traveling to South Carolina, and they were going to get on a flight, and they were seeing family. Some of the family members were not vaccinated. And so the question became, what is the best way to optimize protection and safety for what this family views those principles as? So the child did end up getting vaccinated, but that conversation could have gone a different way, and some have. I'm not here to convince or force anybody to do anything that they otherwise wouldn't do, because that is removing autonomy. And I obviously want people to get vaccinated and protect themselves, but individual health contexts are different. And I don't think we're getting anywhere by shaming people. I don't think anybody who doesn't immediately take a new vaccine is stupid. It's quite the opposite. So public health definitely taught me that people are motivated by different health inspirations and outcomes. But when it became about really individualized fears, I think that was a context I wasn't expecting.
All right, let's transition into Kevin MD article that you wrote. It's titled People Over Profit. Pfizer and Moderna must share vaccine technology. Now, for those of you who get a chance to read your article, can you just walk my audience through it and share the story of why you decided to write it?
Absolutely, thank you. Pfizer and Moderna are the two pharmaceutical companies that developed mRNA vaccines to prevent disease of COVID-19, the spread of it, and severe symptoms. Both of these technologies were very effective, way more effective than we could have anticipated. The original goals for vaccines were to reduce infection by 50, sometimes even 40%. And the numbers from Pfizer and Moderna were incredible. These mRNA vaccines prevented disease in over 90% of the people that were originally taking them. And of course, we're talking about the original variant. More have come since then. And these companies, in my piece, I argue, are responsible for making sure that we achieve some global equity. So I'm based in the United States, in Chicago, Illinois specifically. I have been extremely privileged in the sense that I have not only a choice of vaccine, so I was able to get Pfizer through Rush University, but I'm able to get boosters as they come out at my discretion. And in the United States right now, we're suddenly being faced with whether or not to get a second booster for those of us who are fully vaccinated with 1 or 2 doses and then got a booster after that. A lot of countries are still struggling to even get inoculated at all, to get 1 dose of the vaccine. My public health background tells me that this is a human rights crisis. People are dying unnecessarily because we're waiting on donations to be shipped out. And one of the major arguments that Pfizer, Moderna, some other larger organizations could make is, well, these are corporations, they're here to make money. And I understand that, they are pharmaceutical companies, but we can't wait for donations. There's such a global health onus in protecting lives. And one of the major arguments too is, look, the United States is donating vaccines to other countries. And that's absolutely true. I address this in my article. But it's timely, and the United States has to pay for those vaccines. And Doctors Without Borders has actually identified over 100 different facilities abroad that are capable of making mRNA vaccines in-house, so to speak. And that would speed up the rate in which we can vaccinate the global population.
And in terms of the specific reasons Pfizer and Moderna say they won't share vaccine technology, is it primarily a money issue?
I suspect that it's primarily a money issue. I'm also sensitive to the argument that it's really just about patent technology. They created a brand new, innovative technology that has not worked in other contexts. mRNA vaccines, this is the first time that they're really being used in a very efficacious setting. And they are really, again, saving lives. But yes, I think it's really a money and legal issue as to why they wouldn't readily give up technology to other sites, even under maybe strict legal contracts.
Now, in terms of sharing vaccine technology, is there a solution that threads the needle between the patents and sharing the vaccine widely to other countries?
Yes, I think there are definitely compromises that can be made. Doctors Without Borders identified over 100 sites. 100 sites might not need the technology to do this in the best way. I am not a shipping travel expert. These vaccines need to be transported to the people who need it most. It's a problem that is organic to the United States as well. A lot of hospitals were able to get this technology, but in more rural areas or areas that don't have concentrated populations, getting vaccine rollout was difficult. So this is just a larger scale problem. I do think that donations could also be extremely effective, but they're not being done in an extremely timely, sensitive manner. Right now, there are many sites in the US that have supplies of vaccines that aren't being used, and we're not shipping them. And again, the United States, under federal programming, has donated many doses. 1 billion was promised abroad, but we have to wait for the payment to be processed and then for these companies that are limited in their own capacity. I want to be sensitive to that too. Pfizer and Moderna can't readily produce 500,000 doses in one day and ship them to the exact location they need to be. It makes logical sense to me, but I do think that there are compromises in between. I don't think it has to go to every single site.
Now, who are the groups that are putting pressure on Pfizer and Moderna to share vaccine technology? And are any of those groups within the United States?
Yeah, some of them are definitely United States based. A lot of global health organizations, so local community organizations. For example, Doctors Without Borders, has a lot of different sites. So that's a big pressure. They put out a formal statement saying that this is their position and urging the United States government actually to put more pressure on Pfizer and Moderna. It wasn't an open letter to the pharmaceutical companies themselves. I think that strategy also makes more sense because Pfizer and Moderna, I think many of these organizations and me as an individual understand that they do not have to do anything.
Mm-hmm.
They are their own private corporations. And that is why the United States, I think, government, the federal government, had then promised to purchase and then send off and donate these doses because that was the agreement that they could come to versus putting pressure on two corporations that to donate these for free. So there are a lot of community health advocacy groups in the United States. There are a number of physicians who have written op-eds on this as well. And there is a phenomenal one from a participant who was actually in the Moderna clinical trial. And he removed himself from follow-up because he just felt an ethical collision with being involved in this trial that he was promised and told, well, this is to help, people not die from this terrible disease in an awful pandemic that has plagued the globe for over 2 years now. And this company basically is prioritizing US lives. And so that's why he chose to remove himself.
So what do you expect the next 6 to 12 months to bring? Do you anticipate any organization or any sort of pressure to really move the needle in terms of convincing Pfizer and Moderna to share vaccine technology across the globe?
What I'm hoping happens is federal expansion might feel some more pressure if groups continue to do so. 1 billion doses is a huge promise. So I'm being realistic here as much as my public health brain tells me that with enough pressure, maybe we could do some other negotiating. And I also do want to say that Pfizer and Moderna sort of do have these ongoing conversations about what makes the most sense. They are very well aware that public, not only the US public, but the global public really wants this technology and to be able to vaccinate as many people as possible. So it's very possible the needle gets moved. I don't think in a time efficient manner, unfortunately. I think in order to do this, we really have to keep the pressure up and say it's not acceptable that the federal government buying these vaccines and waiting for donation is the main mechanism to get there. Pfizer and Moderna have also paired with some other smaller organizations, and those contracts are very close to the chest. So I don't have that data, but it's very possible that in the next few months that other promises could be made, and I really hope that they are.
We're talking to Amber Gipson-Fine. She is an epidemiologist and project manager. She wrote the Kevin MD article, People Over Profit, Pfizer and Moderna Must Share Vaccine Technology. Amber, for those clinicians who may be listening to this podcast and this message resonates with, what are some things that they can do on an individual basis?
Absolutely. On an individual basis, I will say I'm privileged to work with so many talented clinicians. And I don't want to make an accusation here, but I do think understandably a lot of healthcare workers are frustrated right now. There has been direct abuse. We're tired. A lot of people are not getting time off or are under chronic stress and are burnt out. But even amid all of that, we made a commitment to make sure that patients feel heard. And my only request is that shaming is reduced. So when someone says, absolutely not, I don't want to get vaccinated, or you don't know what you're talking about, the response there just shouldn't be a threat to that person's intelligence or that person's being. It's frustrating to hear, and I definitely want to lose patience myself. So I think that's one lesson. And the second lesson is I have learned so much from all colleagues across healthcare, physicians, medical assistants, research coordinators. So we are a team, and I think it's beautiful when you're able to rely on team members for expertise that you might not have, even if that's just in patient communication. I am a white woman, and some of my colleagues who are people of color say, you know what, I think this is actually a misnuance in the news right now, and this is a myth that's circulating. Maybe that's something that if it gets brought up could at least be validated. And I think those micro lessons are really important, not only now, but for future care.
And my final question, what are some of your take-home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience?
I think a lot of the take-home messages can just be increase compassion where possible. It's frustrating out here. There's a lot of polarization politically, also scientifically. It's hard to take care of ourselves. So prioritizing mental health in any capacity possible, it's way easier said than done. We have to be able to take care of our teams, ourselves. For those of us who have children or family members that we're caregiving for, that's also another chronic stress. So prioritizing mental health and well-being as much as possible, but also in the effort to educate people, being as aware of the latest technology, global implementation that we can, basically gaining as much information as we can at different points and being compassionate with that knowledge.
Amber, thank you so much for sharing your time and insight. And thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you again.